All right, welcome to this podcast on a leading healthy church in an unhealthy world. It's the title of my subject for my dissertation, and this project is submitted in as partial requirements as an artifact for that discussion and for my dissertation. And so we're looking at the topic of leading healthy church, factors that make a church healthy, as well as observations of what is unhealthy in terms of church. And I'm specifically looking at what we typically call fivefold ministry, which are the ascension gifts listed in Ephesians chapter 4, and their influence in the church. And so I have with me Dwayne White, David McGrew, and Jack Grableski. And rather than me take a lot of time to introduce them, I'm going to invite them to share just a little bit about their own ministry experience, their background, a little bit about how long you've been in ministry, roles you've served in, whether that be pastoral leadership, network leadership. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, and we'll start with Dwayne and then go to David.
All right. Thank you, Paul. So great to be on here, be with you guys. What an honor to share in this project that I'm very excited about. I've been in ministry for 36 years this year. I've done a little bit of everything that you can imagine in church leadership, all the way up to and including planting a church 17, 18 years ago in Denton, Texas, called the Bridge Church. And then I lead a network of churches called the O2 Network, which has churches across America and a couple of other churches around the world. And yeah, I've been sort of received as a prophetic and apostolic voice across the world, been to 65 different nations. So I've watched a lot of the church globally as well as experiencing it locally. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Awesome. I'll come back with the question in a little bit about the difference between apostolic and prophetic, but we'll move on to David McGrew. You introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. And to parrot Dwayne a bit, it's been a wonderful journey to be in this cohort together and to also see it sort of coming to its last corner. It just dawned on me that everything that I thought was at the end of the semester was always at the first part of the semester. So I think we're going to all be expected to go home, except for maybe Chris and Perry and do some more homework on their dissertations. But I'm so happy that today is Freedom Day. Yeah. And one way or the other, she's done. One way or the other, this is the day it has to be turned in. But the relationships and the connections I've been able to make with you all, and even indirectly through you, Jax, meant the absolute world to me. So I'm in right now, sitting on the extreme west coast of Canada. I look to the east and see the United States. I'm in Victoria, British Columbia. I've been in British Columbia for the most of the time since 1981. Gene and I have worked together. We've got like 40, close to 50 years of ministry in now, not quite, but close. We've planted a couple of different churches. We spent most of our time working in this very sparse nation to build a ministry network. Ours turned out to be a little bit differently than probably any of yours were, in that ours had to collect people who weren't necessarily of the same theology or bent. Most of them are more or less like we all are, but they came up from hard knocks and from backward places. So I've had to develop a different setting. I don't have people around me who always like the way I think and aren't always signed on to seeing things from the same perspective. It's required a different, maybe a more, I don't want to say complex, a different kind of leadership So we've led networks. Right now, we've joined 2 networks together. One I led, and one another fellow led, and he's taking the presidential role. I told him like this: he's the husband, I'm the wife. He can do what he wants, but he knows there's trouble if he doesn't do the right thing. So we work together. It's a good sized network. There's probably about 1,000 members, and they probably represent 300 churches. And it is, so far, it's been the pinnacle of my experience and something that I love to travel around. I particularly like to go to some of the more naked, smaller places that are out in the field all by themselves without someone to help them. I too have stepped into a role of apostolic ministry, and we'll leave that there for now.
Awesome. And that network spans pretty much across Canada, the
It
state.
does.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it does.
Wonderful. And then Jack Grableski, tell us a little bit about your ministry.
So I'm not part of your cadre, so I'm the outlier here. Although I've communicated with all of you so much on it, I feel like I could probably tell you where you're at. Anyway, so yeah, so I have a bachelor's degrees from King's College with a kind of I don't know, a focus in the area of linguistics and communication, then a master's, an MTH from Moravian Theological Seminary with an emphasis on biblical languages and Old Testament. Planted a church here in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, pastored here started with a campus ministry and then went on and pastored in the church that Trish and I planted for 40 some years, and handed it over to a young man who's doing quite well. It's become multi-site, and was involved in leading a network on the East Coast with strong Reformed leanings called the Grace Network for years, and then moved on to another network where I'm involved with the leadership team. That network involves about 30 churches, 35 churches on the East and West Coast, and then some into Europe. Been involved with various networks in Europe and Africa. And I am in what's alleged as a retirement, and been kind of working with you guys and a lot of other people over the last couple of years. So, I mean, that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Wonderful. Well, I love the fact that we have 3 people gathered here that are passionate for the church, the broader church, universal church, as well as the local church, and have expressed that, demonstrated that passion through both local church leadership, being involved in personal, you could say pastoral ministry, leading a local church, as well as team leadership in a network and being involved in overseeing churches together with others. With your passion for local church and the strength of the local church, how would you describe or define what is healthy in a local church? What are some factors you look for when you visit a church or experience church, or when you were leading, that were markers for you to know that the church was healthy? And I'll start with Jack. You were the last to talk. You're on my screen. I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I was considering that when I saw the questions that you sent out. It's interesting. The reformers, okay, and I revere the reformers. I'm talking about Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and the reformers. It's really interesting. Their perception of healthy church was threefold. It was their declaration of the gospel, was the word of God being preached, and was the word of God being preached, declaration of the gospel. Oh, and were the sacraments being administered actively to the congregation, which I found very, kind of significant, in that they're not looking at Ephesians 4, health of the congregation, in a Eugene Peterson kind of way. But their assumption was that if those things were operating in the church, they never mentioned fivefold ministry, that the church itself would beget the kind of health that we do see in Ephesians 4:12 and following. So that's one measure. The second measure that I see so much is kinds of comes up in the Great Awakening, which is would be Jonathan Edwards and Jonathan Edwards and you know, the other Great Awakening ministers, which really went to more to holiness. You know, the idea that if the church was holy, that it would fulfill mission and the other kinds of things. But it was really interesting. There was an intensification on the spirit and the moral and ethics of the congregation itself. Of course, Wesley was a big one for that. I mean, it was huge, as was Edwards, as was Spiener and so forth. Then you get all the way over to the charismatic movement of Pentecost. And you know, I mean, if we're really, really honest, you know, when we talk about health of a church in our coffee clutches as charismatics, it usually comes down to the trifecta. What, you know, what are the offerings? You know, how much money are you making? What's your attendance? And how many baptisms did you have? You know, and so I'm really being cheeky here. So I find this really fascinating. So, but ultimately, personally, on that level, I would evaluate the health of a church to be attained is the attainment of the unity of faith and knowledge of the Son of God to the mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, which is, it just sums up everything. And so for me, if I see that operating in the churches that I'm involved with, I'm assuming something's being done awfully right and that there's a health in the church.
Wonderful. Good. Referring right back to Ephesians 4 definition.
Yep.
As the definition of a healthy church.
I think it sums everything up.
Yeah, wonderful. David, anything, your perspective that you'd like to add?
Not to be simplistic, but I'll fall down into Ephesians 4 myself, and verse 16 is probably my benchmark. It's not everything, but just a quick glance through that verse talks about how we draw our life from him, how we connect to each other, and every part or every gift does its part. So I look to try and measure, maybe not the worship service, but the active everyday walk people seem to have with the Lord, particularly the leadership, as you all would. I know I just heard again this week that whether it's just an urban legend, but Jesus, I hope it is, that the average pastor only prays about 15 minutes a day. And I think that explains a lot. I don't think you can pray for anybody, much less even really yourself, if 15 minutes a day is your high water mark. And there's days that we all get absorbed, but without drawing life from him, you're going to connect with other people. It says in that same passage that he lives in the joints. It's not the body parts, it's where the parts connect. Yeah. It's where the parts connect. And if you don't have him as the source, the connections are not going to give life. They're going to give harm. Intuitively, at that point, I think people begin to use their gifts. So I look around to see if people are freely, happily engaging and trying to find what their function is, and they're using it, because the way 16 is written, it all but guarantees growth of some kind. It says the body builds itself up in love. So that seems to be, that's simple, but that's where I start.
That's awesome. Deeply appreciated. Anything else, Dwayne, that you'd like to describe and add to health?
Those are great. I mean, I would echo what those guys said. I think kind of riffing off of Jack a little bit, where Karl Barth talks about the trifecta, if you will, of the reformers being the Bible, the written word, and Jesus, the incarnate word, and then the proclamation of the church or the preached word. I like how Lynn Sweet tweaks that and shifts it a little in his threefold cord of Ecclesiastes, it's not easily broken, is Jesus, the Spirit, and the Scriptures. So I think church that has those three elements in the forefront are important. I think those are big deals. I think I'm trying to think of his name. Bill Johnson says that Jesus is perfect theology. So I think in a nutshell, you could just look at a church and how much does it look like not just the teachings of Jesus, but the life of Jesus. How much are they living the life of Jesus more than just adhering to or upholding the teachings of Jesus? There's things we could talk about, how do they live out relationships? Are they a forgiving group of people? Are they a generous group of people? All of those things. But maybe it's where I'm at this stage of my life and the journey that I'm in. But a big deal to me is how do they process pain? So if we're going to be a healthy church in an unhealthy world, how is that community equipped to deal with and process the pains of life? Because the pain that we don't transform, we will ultimately transfer. So a lot of, you get into culture wars and you get into people spouting things on social media and you get into all these unhealthy behaviors. So much of that, to me, boils down to the fact that they're not knowing how to effectively and productively transform their pain into something beautiful, because everybody's experiencing pain, and therefore they're transferring it to one another. Then that church becomes toxic, not only to one another, but to the world around.
So true.
I
So,
like that a lot.
yeah, yeah. It's a great description of the fruit, whether good or bad, of where you fall on either side of that coin on how you process. Um, just shifting gears a little bit, how would you describe fivefold ministry found in Ephesians 4, what we typically call fivefold ministry, those gifts of apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, teacher? How would you describe their relationship to the local church? Would you describe them as offices, positions that are held by individuals with authority, or would you describe them as gifts having influence? I know that could be a very broad topic, but what would be your initial impression on how those gifts relate to the local church? And since we ended with Dwayne, we'll start there and go back around.
But talking about going to Dwayne or me?
We'll go to Dwayne.
Okay. Man, it's great questions. I think one of the first things when you talk about apostles and prophets in particular, we have to talk about foundations because they're the foundations. So they should be foundational rather than being top down, they're bottom up. They don't stand over, but they come under and they support, they lift up. When you look at a building, very few people walk in and say, man, that's an impressive foundation you got there. They point out all the ornate architecture, all of the furnishings, all of the beautiful things that are noticeable. Very few people talk about the foundations, but yet we come into church and we want to lift up a couple of people or a couple of functions and say, man, that's the beauty. I think they should be foundational. I think when you talk about all the ascension gifts in Greek there, and I'm not a Greek scholar like Grubby is, but in Ephesians 4, the word there, when it says he gave gifts, is doma or man gifts. So well, however you want to define them, and I'll give a little bit of a where I think they land in a minute, my personal opinion on it. But wherever you land with it, I think we have to settle the issue that he's saying there. It's not that these people possess gifts. At this point, they become the gift. So whether you want to call that an office or a function or an unction that functions or a, whatever, which where Grubby's probably going to go, because I know, because we've talked about this a lot. Wherever you go with all that, I think there is a distinction that at that point they aren't holding a gift, they are the gift. That man or woman, that individual becomes the gift to the body, and they're there for equipping. So again, if you want to call it an office that is an equipping office, then I'm okay with that. I have no problem. I think the more I live, the longer I go, the less I see them as offices, although I don't have a problem with that. I get where people are going with that. I probably more knee-jerk react to the where that takes us if we're not careful than whether it's accurate or not. But if you think of it in terms of they're there to equip the body as a gift, to equip the body in those gifts so that they can release those gifts across the body collectively. So the teacher helps equip the teaching arm and the teaching part of the church. The evangelist isn't there to evangelize or be traveling ministry, but rather they're there to equip evangelism within the body. Prophets aren't there to prophesy so much as at Ephesians 4 ascension gift. They become the gift, equipping stirring up the hearing ear of the church and equipping the church to hear the Lord, so on and so forth. So pastoral to care, we could go through all five. But to me, they're foundational, they're equipping gifts that help make sure all of those elements are active in the body.
That is a beautiful picture. Just to say that goes in line with really the theme and background of the dissertation, recognizing them not as positions of authority, but as what I call, referencing them as spices within the anointing. They are elemental flavors, fragrances within the anointing that activate the same gifts in the anointing of the body. So I know in one of our network meetings just a few weeks ago, our Leaders Day, that Jack Wroblewski did a series where he called these same gifts as unctions that function. Would you like to, Jack, elaborate a little bit more on your definition and how you see them functioning?
Yeah, I grew up in the charismatic movement as an evangelical Christian, and but I was raised within Catholicism, so I had to kind of like reach into both historical denominations pretty heavily, as well as into evangelicism. And so one of the things that was talked about all the way back in the 1970s are these offices, are these offices upon which you build what were called and are called apostolic networks. And, all of the chatter had to do with that was external to the church. Who's your apostle, who's your prophet, who's your pastor? And yet, just at a young age, I'm traveling around churches, preaching hither and yon, and I'm seeing fairly healthy churches. In other words, I'm seeing, as David talked about, the stuff of Ephesians 12 and following functioning in these churches. And none of them have an apostle, a prophet, a pastor, a teacher, an evangelist, and yet they're all chattering away about the wonder of those things external to themselves. And I'm saying, well, there's something weird here, because if I call it supply side theology. If this stuff is working in the flipping church, where is it originating from? And if you look at Ephesians 4, those you call them spices, I call them unctions. And David was talking about everything being at the joint. I call them unctions that function at the junctions. And these things are going on. So my next question was, as a pastor, is there any way to determine these things? Is there any way to measure them? I even developed a metric and then begin to forge teams on the basis of them. And I found that it's eminently, we still do it at NC4, and Ian's doing it, the guy who took over for me, where you can really get kind of a profile of your fragrance, of the unctions that are there, and try and understand how you can do that to build teams, set people in leadership, and so forth. Now, that brings us around, all the way around to the whole thing. Well, is there an apostle? Is there a prophet? I agree with Dwayne basically on that. Yeah, these things can become so apparent in an individual's life and ministry that they're identified with the very thing, like prophet. People call me a prophet sometimes. I have no problem with that. But I'm a local church guy. I want to find out how this stuff is going on, how we can measure it, and then how we can bring people in from our quote apostolic teams and end quotes, and begin to really stir up these things for greater equipping and everything that Dwayne talked about. That's kind of where I'm at on this. And so these are like charismatic designer people.
It's a great description, And from both inside the church and from inside the local church and from a broader view, from a network view. So David, anything else that you'd like to expound on and how
I'll try to contribute to the conversation. Dwayne was thoughtfully succinct, and Jack was expansive. So the new ground's been taken and the solid ground's been tuned up. But I'll come in on this thought. This is something that would be subject to your all interpretations and understanding. But where you ask about were they gifts or officers? If they're officers, our culture's torqued it around so people try and go from place to place and be an officer where they're not commissioned, and it's caused some trouble. I think our culture itself has overlooked the fact that even if we are apostles and prophets, we are not in that same category that the originators were. We can't be. Common sense says we can't be, but I don't know that everybody has that taste of common sense. So the effect is, if we have to live inside of what Isaiah or Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John or Paul said, then that means they've got authority over us. That means we're fitting inside their construct. So to that degree, we, like everybody else in the church, are a gift given by Jesus. Now, the thing that I love about this passage, it's circular, and it has implications that I dare not say. But where we saw in Ephesians that he gave gifts unto men, you guys know, it's a quote out of the Psalms where it says he received gifts.
That's right.
So that suggests some movement. That suggests taking of something that somebody else had and giving it to that wouldn't use it and giving it to someone who will. There are some deep questions we have to consider here, because we need to raise up apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers to do exactly as Dwayne and Jack said, empower the body of Christ to be that. But it'd be far better, it'd work far better in the culture if they weren't left thinking that it was a position that they got to hold for life that fit every environment and circumstance they went into.
Wonderful. Yeah. And Let me kind of shift gears into the next question. What are ways that as local churches, we can be intentional to invite, release, activate these gifts? I think Jack mentioned one thing that they've done. They have an assessment that they give. My understanding from that is to the church body wide in order to identify alignments or fragrances, if you will, and to begin to organize people into companies or communities associated. First of all, was I understanding that's one way that you guys cooperate or activate these gifts? Jack?
Oh, yeah. Well, of course, I mean, we recognize in Dwayne, an apostolic, I'm talking about the churches that I pastored, an apostolic unction. Here, this is really interesting. Okay, a whole bunch of years ago, I decided the weakest part of my whole posture for ministry was evangelism, right? I mean, look, I'm a teacher. I know how to give reason for the hope that lieth within me. And I thought, but man, I just don't lead people to Jesus easily, So anyway, so I chose a little town, a little Welsh town in Pennsylvania called Penargil. And I decided it was manageable. It was, I think, about 4,000 or 5,000 people. And I decided that over a summer, I would have personally evangelized every household in that town and knock on the doors over the course of the weekends. So this is when I was a young pastor. So I started doing that, and people received me. I was knocking on doors. I was doing it, but nobody was coming to Christ. And I had this young guy who was still with us, who's an ex-Marine, but just an obvious street evangelist. And I said, "Will you come with me?" And he said, "Well, yeah, I'll go with you, Grub." And so we went up and we started knocking on doors. And what I discovered, because I was kind of walking in his anointing, we talk about anointings or sense, we have these metaphors. What I found out when I was with him, I could talk about the broom closet and people would want to come to Jesus. And I just learned something about how these giftings work and how they work in tandem in terms. And yeah, I mean, kind of, that's the way I'm at. I want the Dwayne train in a church that needs it. And there are other apostolic people and prophetic people and so forth. And so, but watch this. It's not the consequence of office so much as it is relationship. It's a joint. Yeah, we're back to joints. It's the joint that supplieth, as the King James says. And so my relationship with him is a factor for supplying to the church that I would pastor the vitality of prophetic insight, the vitality of apostolic insight, and so forth, which is a marked departure from the New Apostolic Reformed movement, which sees the thing as rather an office with the same accoutrements as a bishop or an office within the church at large.
Wonderful. So relationships, once again, are the key that release or activate the resonance of that gift in other people. Dave, anything else that you'd like to share about how local churches can be intentional to invite or activate all these gifts in their context?
Well, you summed up my thought right there. Jack, you did a great job. You reminded me of a guy that I had in church one time. He could stand up and read the church bulletin and cry on people to get saved.
Yeah.
If I stand up and give an altar call, it looks like they're joining the Marine Corps and they go to battle tomorrow. I wouldn't get saved in my altar call if I didn't have to. So I know what you're talking about there. I think I think in the world we live in, the world I live in at least, people are not quick to build relationships of intimacy. And I think we have to raise them up, certainly in church, by giving information and opportunity to learn who they are. But it's having somebody close enough to you who can see who you are, that continually gives you opportunities, small and great, spends time with you. I told my pastor when I first started off decades ago, and this like Grubby, this was my baptism into the entire thought. It was back in the 70s, that I learned more from him sitting across the desk than I did from the pulpit. I don't think he liked it, but it was still true, because I learned not just what the script said, I learned how to process the script. And I think that we also, all of us, have to have always key people around us that we're spending time with intimately, that goes beyond what we give to the rest of the group. In doing that, we've got the best chance of passing on who we are to the next generation that we'll ever have. More than our words, as you all would preach and say, the Spirit gets taught. So I'm like Grubby. I'm always talking about the need for the proper kind of relationships, properly executed. Jesus walked his life out, and he told people where he was going, even when they didn't want to hear it. And he prepared them to take the place that he was in when he was no longer there. It happened intentionally by walking through life close enough that the same mindset and ideas were shared.
Awesome. Yes, I perceive a theme. Dwayne, what would you like to add as well?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it can be said enough. Relationships paramount. Not, none of us, I don't think, would just go through the phone book or Charisma magazine and invite the hottest whatever to come, because that violates the whole premise of relational connection. I think the only thing I would add is we invited in people. I'll stick with the theme of an evangelist. We invited in Roy Todd, who some of you would know from England, Ireland. He's Irish. He lived in England. Invited him in as an evangelist to speak to us many times for that purpose. Brought in several apostolic figures, Stuart Bell from England, whom you had on the podcast, Bishop Tony Miller, many would know, Jack, Trish. Brought in Jack and Trish as prophetic voices for that same thing. Even in the early days as a church plant, I would bring them into our leaders and just let them. I have vivid memories of them sitting with a cup of coffee, their legs crossed, leaning back in a chair and prophesying over every leader in our group, in our church plant. But here's the thing I want to emphasize about that. If the setting was appropriate, I wanted them not to do the stuff, but to teach us how to do the stuff, even if they were going to do the stuff. So it does no good to bring, I'm not talking about bringing in the professional, quote unquote, to then be an evangelist for us, or be a prophet for us, or hear God for us, etc. No. They're to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. So if the context allowed, it's fine if you want to do the stuff, but teach us how to do the stuff. If the context didn't allow, then I did that work on the back end. I would tell our guys, hey, Roy Todd's coming in. He's an evangelist. We're going to tap into the grace on his life as an evangelist, but we're going to evangelize. We're going to debrief. What did we pick up on? What did we learn? And some of it, like Grubby said, may just simply be they have a grace on their life to do it. Okay, well, God, can you impart that grace into us? Maybe not to the same measure, the same degree. I don't know. That's arguable, but otherwise it's pointless to me. And it doesn't, that actually makes for a less healthy church, because you're dependent on the pros to come do the stuff. But rather, can we, for lack of better terms, employ, and I don't mean that monetarily, but I mean that in terms of deploying their gifts among us to come in and activate us, stir us up. So if the context allowed, I wanted to do it intentionally. If the context didn't allow, I did it intentionally on the back end to try to draw on that so that our church would be more effective at it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. I love that too. As you were describing it, I was just thinking of Acts chapter 1, what Jesus began to do and teach. And it's a both and. And we tend to do either or, not both and. And so being able to mobilize, receive from people who have developed those gifts and employ them as you described, to do and to teach, we get the greatest effectiveness of reproduction. The goal is not to receive from, but to reproduce what's operating through the gift, so that we, as we reproduce it, the world can receive from the local church.
And to me, that's how they become the gift rather than just having the gift. They become the gift because they're empowering, activating, sparking, whatever you want to, metaphor you want to use, whatever word you want to use, the gift within the gifts, or that gift within the body.
I love that. I'm making notes. A gift awakens that same gift in others.
Mhm.
And so that presence of gift awakens. So related to that, just kind of, we have a few minutes to kind of wrap up. How, I think we're already discussing, what are ways that these gifts strengthen the local church, bring greater health, greater strength, and related to that, can a local church become unhealthy by limiting the kinds of gifts? In other words, if you have one church that's strong in one area but weak in another, is there a need for balance across the board of the gifts in order to be strong and healthy? That's about 3 questions rolled up, but just to get your broader perspective on that. Well, how about we start with Dave this time?
I felt like that was going to happen. Was that prophetic? I'm not sure. Those are really good questions. Those are really good questions from someone who spent a big part of his career surrounded by churches of 50 people in small communities who didn't have the money or the contacts to bring anybody else in except the pastor. That eventually the pastor, whomever he might be, tried to be more than what he was, tried to cover all the bases. And after a while, they were just spinning their wheels. So, as you all said, it's essential to have a balance of all of them. I don't think all of them are needed on a 4 times a year schedule. Maybe they are. I think if the idea prevailed that they were raising up people in your own midst to take those roles, it would sort of organically begin to imbue the rest of the body and the structures there with that kind of a spirit. I think if they're neglected, I think it hurts the church. I think if the attitude's not, as Dwayne posited, that they're realizing that they're supposed to be there to build who they are into somebody else, into the congregation, to the body, I think it hurts the church. So yeah, you're right. It does require a wisdom, and I think that's probably what us 3 for sure would have encountered over the years. You kind of come to a place where you understand that you have to join something bigger than you, that keeps getting bigger than you, to have the context, who have the ability to go someplace where the money's not there. Money's an awkward question in apostolic circles, so that the money's there to pay for somebody to go do something, because perhaps the guy on the other end doesn't have a healthy enough context to start with.
Brilliant. So that connects that local church to a broader network that becomes the resource to the church.
Which is healthy in so many ways.
Yeah, rather than the church just being a resource to the network. It's a mutual relationship, an unction that a junction that has an unction that functions. Okay, Jack, any other perspective you'd like to add to
I
that
think
balance?
more than the word balance, I would use the word comprehensiveness. I mean, to the measure of the fullness. I mean, that's the teachings for its fullness, the fullness of Christ. So the question then, is, how full is this leadership? How full is this congregation? What needs to be added? What needs? Now, I led a network that I helped shut down completely because it was essentially, I couldn't jar it from being a teaching network. Firmly ensconced in really good Reformed tradition, but I was so constipated prophetically, I didn't know whether I was coming or going. So, I feel that there needs to be a comprehensive fullness of the comprehensive fullness of Christ Himself reflected, and of course that's a discernment, isn't it? And really, that's what apostles do better than anybody, is discern that comprehensiveness, even though they might not be the individual to address it themselves. So that's where I would go with that.
Okay. Dwayne, before I give another thought, yes.
Yeah, I think there's two old adages that could become cliche, or probably did become cliche, but I think they're helpful. The apostolic helps us get with our governing. The prophetic helps us with our guiding. The evangelist helps us with our gathering. The pastor helps us with our guarding. And the teacher helps us with our grounding. I think those are great. That's great alliteration. I think if you think of the hand of God, get it the right way here. The hand of God, apostles come in first, right? Prophets are like the pointing finger that point us in the direction and guidance. This finger reaches out the furthest, like the evangelist. It's going to touch first because it's the longest. The pastor is like a covenant. It's relational. It's caring. It's like a ring finger. It's covenantal. And then the pinky is the teacher that completes us and brings it all together. I had to write those down real quick while those guys were talking because it's been so long since I thought of them. I wasn't sure I could remember them off the top of my head. So, but although those things got wacky and, there's all kinds of stuff about, oh, this is the hand of God in your life. It really is the hand of God moving in a church, not in 5 people, not in 5 men or 5 women, but functions that I think with all of those spices, you have an anointing. With all of those elements, you have the hand of God. Again, we're mixing metaphors, we're moving them around. With all of those G's, you have a complete picture of some things and elements that are needed within a church.
I love that. And yeah, you can read my dissertation and get all those again, as I quote Bill Hammond originally, as part of the description of the functions and how those elements function in the local church. Related to that, and what I hear us saying in almost an intangible way of discernment, how they work together in Moses, as he records it in Exodus. It's the work of the perfumer, the apothecary, that role, which, as David described, is organic, it's a discerning, it's not linear, but it takes an awareness and to make it flow together. It's not a calendar that we implement as something we discern is absent, something we discern that needs to be strengthened to bring it for a specific season. It may be, now I'm not asking a question, I'm just talking, that in a season where the church is looking to fulfill what the prophet has declared is the next mission, it may need a stronger element than another element. So if the next season of the church is evangelistic, you need to be more intentional as an apothecary to bring in the evangelists in preparation for that season. If the next season is missionaries or whatever that next is, you can lean into that gift more for that season, whether that season be 3 months or 3 years. You're discerning what the need of the local church is to accomplish the purpose of its assignment in the season and the context that it's at. How am I right on that? Give me some reflection. Am I scratching the right itch? We're quiet.
We're
Well,
reflecting.
Yeah. I think you're right, especially to this extent. I mean, Dwayne was talking about the prophetic being guidance. How many times in my church life has a prophet come in, or even we've had a peculiarly prophetic person within the construct of the church that pointed something out that I, as a pastor, and was really kind of blind to, and that there needed to be a complete shift, and the only way you know whether that's true or not is the gift of discernment, the discerning of spirits, and I mean, but that's been a mainstay, really. I think I would guess that's been a mainstay in Dwayne and Dave and your lives as well. So yeah, I would certainly go with that. I mean, where you're just sitting there and the prophetic person saying something doesn't smell right, or the apostolic individual who's got this tremendous sense of there's an imbalance here, maybe in the trajectory of funding or whatever, and saying something doesn't smell right, to use your metaphor, Paul, and say, let's get a little fragrance over here to get the right smell and its fullness. Yeah, I like that.
Any other thoughts from Dave or Dwayne?
I think you were right. I think you hit it on the head, and I don't want to look like I'm trying to find an easy way out of the question, but I think you used words like discerning, fragrance, scent. That all falls back on somebody's spirituality, not just their gifting. And I think that over the years, we've probably studied the skin off the idea of office and
Cool.
calling, and missed the underground work of what their actual spirituality was. Because without that, there's nothing more to follow than prescriptions. You can watch what somebody else is doing. You can come up with some ideas, perhaps, and do some things, and maybe they'll work. But somebody's got to have a place in God that goes beyond what their function is, or they will misapply what the spiritual next steps are. They won't even read the signs.
Yeah, I think that's so good. I might just add really along the same veins as these guys, but in what you're saying, Paul, there's a discernment, and it's all spiritual. It's all got to be spiritually discerned. However, sometimes that comes just as a good leader looking and going, this doesn't look like Jesus, or this isn't, we need an infusion of something here, there, or wherever. So it can appear to be very practical. So it's kind of spiritual common sense, if you will, spiritual horse sense to use my background. Or it could be out of the blue prophetic utterance that we've never thought of or seen, like Jack was saying, where someone comes in and just declares, boom, and you haven't seen it, you couldn't see it, and now you see it. I don't think one's better than the other. I think we need to expect and look for and have both from time to time.
Excellent. In terms of, I want to present, this will be kind of the closing question. We can then wrap up. I want to present a process as we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, where Paul says, we've talked a little bit about this. Paul says, first apostles, then prophets, evangelists or teachers, evangelists, and then he talks about administrative helps. Is there any merit to looking at it this way? If you're coming into a new season, you need a apostolic prophetic viewpoint about that's kind of the introduction to what's coming next. And then it's fleshed out more by the administrators in the gifts that follow. The teachers begin to teach then on what the apostolic and prophetic is pointing to. And then the administrators implement what the teachers have been teaching. There's a little bit of a linear flow in what Paul says. He says first, proton, not arche, hierarchy, but proton first in order. Is there a flow that can happen or a process of introduction leading to follow through?
I'll just jump in and say, man, that'd be great.
It's a nice thought, huh?
Yeah, I think that it could. You asked the question, could it work that way? Yes. Does it always? In my experience, no. But I think it is something to look at and look for and to work towards and to think about in our strategic, sort of Pauline wise master builder profiles. But in the scope of life and church and the messiness of all that happens, I think that's where the Holy Spirit will just interject and mess up our linear timelines. And the wind blows the tree doesn't move the wind. And so I do think that we can have all of our patterns that we would love to see and maybe can work, but just I'm a real pragmatist. So I don't think, and I wouldn't want a pastor out there to think, man, I just failed because every time I try to start being that strategic, life happens and our church struggles with all of these things and da 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 da. Well, that's just normal and that's okay. And I think all those things will get in there. If we're led by the Spirit, whether they fit our linear timeline or not. That's my 2 cents worth.
Prophetic pragmatist, those aren't 2 words you often hear in the same sentence.
And we need to more.
Yeah, we do. I would agree with Dwayne. I think when you start trying to wire it any tighter than that, what you end up with is the formula. It's over in 1 Corinthians 12 about different gifts, different ministries, and I forgot the third one, different functions, whatever it is. So it's somewhat subject to the operator at that point. And I don't know that you could ever formulate what a good prediction is. You're right in that they all have to go together. If they don't go together, if it doesn't move away from the prophetic vision or the apostolic sense of government. It doesn't get administrated, handled, built, modeled, and lived in other people's lives.
Beautiful. Grubby?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I think it's pragmatically so.
Yeah.
Pragmatically so.
Pragmatically messy.
I have a funny thing I keep thinking about. Somebody said something a while ago, but I had a short time where I was in communication with the Jones brothers over in England, Bryn and Carrie.
Oh yeah.
And I forget which one told me, but I think it was Bryn. Said he'd gone somewhere with a prophet. They were carrying on like we're talking about. There's an apostle and a prophet. The prophet gave a word in the church that was absolutely going to change the church structure, the church government, and everything in it. Of course, the leaders wanted to speak with him afterwards. Bryn, I believe it was, said, well, okay, we'll come downstairs and do that. The prophet said, I got to go to the room for a minute. And he said he went on down. Bryn did. It was laboring away with them, and they were not happy. Prophet didn't show up. He went up to the room to check on him, and he was laying in bed reading a book. He was reading a book. He said, I thought you were coming down. He said, no. He said, I've done my part. The rest of it's up to you. I don't think that's going to work. You got to own what you said.
Yeah.
You got to own what you said and give an account for it to the people that heard.
Amen.
Yeah. Yeah. Have enough relationship to own what you say.
Yeah.
Well, that's all super brilliant, helpful, pragmatic as what the local church needs, not just philosophical. And as you all work on, if you will, both ends of the stick, the local church side as well as the network side, and have seen it all come and go. Any last thoughts that you would all like to leave with about how it brings health to the church, how fivefold ministry strengthens and helps and makes the church healthier?
I'll just say that I thank you for letting me be a part of adding to the conversation in your project. I think it's going to be wonderful, and I yield the balance of my time to the good gentleman from Canada and Pennsylvania.
I yield mine to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
The only thing I would say is that what you're doing, I encourage you in terms of what you're doing, Paul, because it's in contrast to so much that's going on in the larger charismatic circles. We're in a season of big change right now. And what was from 1970 through, I'm going to say 2010, is now really altering younger pastors and younger leaders into a new understanding. And when C. Peter Wagner published his book back in the 70s on apostles and prophets, and essentially identified them as offices, and and all these guys are restorationists, they mean well and so forth. That became the nomenclature and the thinking and across the body of Christ for decades, and it's changing. And I think the tack that you're taking within the scope of an Ephesians 4:12 and following, being indicative of unctions within the church, is just a great thought. I hope something really comes of it for you beyond your thesis, because I think pastors need to be able to understand it and see it and use it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Here.
Adds a lot of value and hope. So I just want to say thank you to all of you again for both your expressions of wisdom, but also for your life lived out in sometimes pain in order to gain the wisdom. And thank you for sharing it, not only with me, but through this process with others.
Thank you so much. It was an honor.
Love you guys.
Love you too.
Bless you.
Blessing.
Thank you.